Welcome back to another episode of Election and Chill. Today we'll be discussing the 1794 to 1795 midterm elections. Before we get any further, please don't forget to like and subscribe and comment below so you can be part of our notification squad. In the course of American history, elections are rarely determined by foreign affairs. With few exceptions, the American public has rarely considered foreign affairs as a top election priority. However, there are exceptions to this rule, such as the case of the 1794 to 1795 midterm elections. A year earlier, George Washington had been unanimously re-elected as President of the United States, even though his political opponents, now referred to as the Democratic-Republican Party, had gained a majority in both houses of Congress. A hostile Congress against the presidency was going to be problematic for George Washington, as he had to deal with events stirring in the old continent of Europe. In 1793, the French people had killed their king and queen Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Following this heinous act, the powers of Europe were tired of the revolution brewing in France and declared war on the French Republic. Reactions to the revolutions in the United States was mixed and very polarizing. The Federalist Party, led by Alexander Hamilton, was decidedly pro-British and was opposed to the revolution. They believed that revolutions, similar to what happened in France, would spread all over the world and cause anarchy. The Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, disagreed. They believed that since the French Revolution was clearly inspired by the American one, it was only natural that the United States shift its foreign policy to supporting France. George Washington, who had been re-elected president unanimously, tried to avoid conflict with both France and Britain. However, this was becoming increasingly more difficult. Since public opinion was so adamantly pro-French, Citizen Genet, the French ambassador, had been recruiting American privateers to fight on behalf of the French. This angered just about everybody, including Thomas Jefferson, so Genet was dismissed. Britain, though, had been consistently violating the conditions of the 1783 Treaty of Paris. The Royal Navy had been interfering with the United States' ability to conduct commerce with the French, and even began to force American sailors to join the Royal Navy. In addition, the British still had forces in what is now modern-day Maine and Michigan, which was in direct violation of the treaty. It was becoming increasingly clear that America was about ready to go to war with Britain, unless an agreement could be reached. So, Washington dispatched John Jay to Britain to negotiate a commerce treaty with the Crown. Jay knew full well going into negotiations that the United States was not in a strong negotiation position. Acting on Hamilton's orders, Jay was advised to 1. Negotiate a treaty with Britain, but to also increase America's dependency on British commerce. The only thinly veiled threat that Jay could make at this point was a promise that the United States would join Sweden and Denmark in a neutrality agreement that he said could be enforced with the use of arms. However, Hamilton, ever the insider, privately told the British that Jay was effectively just bluffing, and he had no real intention of joining such an arrangement. Nevertheless, Jay did extract some concessions from the British, including the withdrawal of British troops from Maine and Michigan. In return, the British were to leave these forts, and in return, the United States would gain, quote, most favored nation trade status with Britain, which would in effect restrict American commerce to countries outside of Britain, and our ability to trade with the West Indies was also greatly curtailed. An innovation of the Treaty of Jay was the introduction of an arbitration in which international disputes were to be settled within court proceedings. Controversially, though, Jay wasn't even able to fully compel the British to stop imprisoning American sailors on the high seas. While the contents of the treaty remained technically secret, it was becoming growing public knowledge that Jay was in Britain and that he was supposedly selling the country out. Democrat-Republican leaning newspapers were especially hostile to the treaty, as Jay himself was a staunch Federalist and a conservative, and people knew that he was acting on Hamilton's orders. An increasing number of discontented Americans began to feel that America was slowly starting to become recolonized by Britain. This growing anti-British sentiment can also be seen in the lens of a growing sense of American nationalism. When the Third Congress of the United States gavelled out, the Democratic-Republican Party had a slight majority of 54 seats to the Federalist 51 seats. The Democratic-Republicans were led by Friedrich Muhlenberg of Pennsylvania's 2nd District. The Federalists, meanwhile, were led by Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey's at-large district. All 105 districts were up for grabs in this election, and 52 seats were needed to win a majority. As was customary during this time, states held their elections on different election days. New Hampshire was the first state to hold its election, which it did on August 25, 1794. A New England state with Federalist leanings, New Hampshire sent 3 Federalist and 1 Democratic Republican to the United States Congress. There was a runoff election in December, with Abigail Foster winning the 4th Congressional District. The next day, on August 26, 1794, Rhode Island held its election and sent 2 Federalists to Congress. On September 15, 1794, Connecticut held its election. All 7 of its at-large districts elected Federalist. Delaware, a swing state, held its election on October 5, 1794, and sent 1 Democratic Republican to the Congress, and this was a swing away from the Federalists and towards the Democratic Republicans. So there was a Federalist beforehand and had been replaced by a Democratic Republican. Georgia and Maryland held their elections on October 6, 1794. Georgia had sent 2 Democratic Republicans to the House, and no Federalists were elected. In Maryland, a swing state at the time, 4 Democratic Republicans and 4 Federalists were elected. Pennsylvania held its election on October 14th. 13 seats were up for grabs, with 1 district, the 4th District, sending 2 representatives. The 4th District consisted of Montgomery, Bucks, and Northampton counties. 9 seats were sent as Democratic Republicans and 4 as Federalist. This was a 1-seat net gain for the Democratic Republicans. South Carolina held its election on October 14th as well. 6 of its seats were up for grabs, with 4 Democratic Republicans and 2 Federalists winning. Massachusetts held its election on November 3rd. Of its 14 districts, 10 were elected as Federalist and 4 as Democratic Republicans. This actually saw a 1-seat net gain in favor of the Democratic Republicans, even in conservative Massachusetts. New York held its election on December 12th. 10 seats were up for grabs in this type of swing state. There was a 3-seat net gain for the Democratic Republicans and away from the Federalist. In total, New York sent 6 Democratic Republicans and 4 Federalists. New Jersey, a Federalist stronghold at the time, held its election on December 30th and sent all 5 of its Federalist seats to Congress. Vermont held its election also on December 30th. Vermont was a swing state in Federalist-dominated New England. Vermont sent one Federalist and one Democratic Republican, and again, this was a one-seat net gain for the Democratic Republicans. North Carolina held its election on February 13th, 1794. 10 seats were up for grabs. The seats were unchanged as 9 seats were won by Democratic Republicans and 1 was won by the Federalist. On March 7th, 1795, just 3 days after the Third Congress had gavelled out, the Jay Treaty finally returned to the United States and received little support from even the special session of the Senate that was called to ratify it. This was because the Senate at the time was controlled by the Democratic Republicans. The Senate narrowly approved the treaty with some caveats, and Washington signed it into law. Elections were continued as follows. Virginia held its election on March 16, 1795, and 19 seats were up for grabs. There was a 2-seat swing away from the Federalists and towards the Democratic Republicans. On June 29, 1795, the suspicion of many of voters had been confirmed when a draft leak of the treaty was leaked by the Democratic Republican-leaning newspaper, the Aurora General Advertiser. This, which one could say was the very first leak in American history, and it was met with anger by the majority of the population, who felt vindicated by Jay, who they felt was selling out America, and that the United States was slowly but surely moving back and towards Britain's sphere of orbit. The reactions at the election booths were clear in Democratic strongholds like Kentucky, which held its election on September 5th, 1795. 2 seats were up for grabs and easily were won by the Democratic Republicans. The final results of the 4th Congress were as follows. Of the 105 seats up for grabs in this election, 59 were won by the Democratic Republicans, and 47 of the seats were won by the Federalists. There was a clear victory for the Democratic Republicans as they controlled now 55% of the seats in the House, and the Federalists only controlling 44% of the seats. As was typical, as we saw in the last election and in this election, the Federalists further strengthened their base of support in the New England and in the Mid-Atlantic states, while the Democratic Republicans solidified their majority in the South and in the growing frontiers. Tennessee, which did not hold an official election as it would not be admitted into the Union until June 1st of 1796 during this first Congress. However, it became a Democratic-Republican stronghold and sent a non-voting delegate who easily became a Democratic-Republican state. The 4th Congress convened on March 4th, 1795, and in this new Congress it was very much so hostile to Washington and to the Jay Treaty. The House reflected the mood of public opinion, which had created a liberal form of nationalism that had seen Britain as an arbiter of reactionary and arch-monarchical forces, and was sympathetic to France. The House tried to legislate around the Jay Treaty, but yet Washington stood his ground and reasserted his constitutional authority as the nation's top diplomat and the architect of American foreign policy. Inevitably, Congress relented and provided the necessary funds to enforce the treaty. While the reactions were not ideal for Jay, he was in fact burned in effigy, the American people eventually grew to accept the treaty for what it was. While the United States did not get many material benefits out of the treaty, it did achieve its primary task, and that was to secure the peace between Britain and with the United States. And so, up until 1812, the United States and Great Britain would be in peace. But not forever. This has been Elections and Chill, and thanks for joining.